Before we move on, I would just like to do an acknowledgement of country. So we'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay our respects to the elders, both past, present and emerging. And you're going to talk to this. No, this is your work.
I think most of you, looking at who's here so far, most of you know who we are, but we sort of always feel that we shouldn't just launch in because obviously there are people who don't. I'm Jace, this is Sophie, and together we set up Birch Tree Centre, which is really just a collective of psychologists, social workers, psychotherapists, kind of, all working together with the goal of, I guess, providing a kind of holding environment for the clinicians that, you know, a sort of safety and holding for clinicians that allows us to then sort of ripple down effect of holding clients, in particular kind of specialising really in working with developmental trauma. So sort of, I guess, 3/4. It's funny, someone came on board and said, I've started to think that everybody you get has a narcissistic mother. She said, it's this sort of, you know, it's this sense of, I guess, for us, it's very much about things that happened in the past, most of our clients, and sort of how the ramifications now. And do you want to talk about why we actually called it addiction and eating disorders as well?
Yeah, so when Jason and I set up the centre, I've worked at RPA, drug and alcohol, and I had done some academic work around addictions, and Jason worked at Jarrah House, and then I had worked at the Children's Hospital in Melbourne in the eating disorders unit, and Jason had done some work at Northside, I think, although you don't like to let that one out of the bag too often. And we both realised that in that sort of work that we had done, that so often underneath the presentation was really trauma, and that the different presentations of addictions and eating disorders were really just an ingenious attempt to try and survive this world and survive the impact of childhood in people who were adults. And so we realised that we really needed to put trauma first, but then also kind of welcome people who were, really acknowledge that it's an ingenious coping strategy, and to also really change the frame around the way in which traditional models have approached addictions and eating disorders, to actually bring into the space the issues of, developmental childhood trauma. So that was kind of why we came at it from that way.
And I think the masterclasses, and sort of getting onto tonight's one, the goal, I guess, of tonight is, this isn't a how, just as our masterclasses are not a kind of how-to around addiction or eating disorders or whatever it is. The goal of them is to really help develop thinking and to start to kind of tap into looking at things from different areas, and in particular to put into place some of the areas that you don't learn a huge amount about at uni or in any of our trainings, sort of whatever that may be, and then you come out and you're sort of faced with people often sort of with rampant addictions without often that base frame of understanding, what are the different models out there? How does this work? How does it relate to, I know I'm kind of doing trauma work, but there's addiction. What's the link between them? How do we make sense of this? And also I want to say that pretty much everything we would cover in these, we would talk about with clients. So this is not a kind of, oh, you need all this and you wouldn't bring it in the room. Most of what we talk about today, I would be regularly bringing in if I was talking to clients with addiction. And I would say when you're working with someone with complex trauma, I don't think I've got anyone who wouldn't have an addiction of some description.
No. Well, I mean, my perspective is that every human has a weak spot that could become an addiction if things went wrong. And so the thing that you often say, Jace, is if you've had a really, really crap day at work, when you get home, you don't make yourself an iceberg and cottage cheese salad sandwich. You actually go and reach for something. And so whatever that thing is that you reach for to numb the pain and stress is kind of your weak spot. And everybody has, I think everybody has one to some degree. And, it's about kind of, how extreme those sort of behaviours kind of go. I think the other thing is that the way we teach and the way we do our work is really, we don't like to other anyone. We're all, our sort of attitude is we're all bozos on the bus together. We're all humans kind of clunking along trying to find a way. As Ram Dass says, we're all walking. We're just walking each other home. I think I probably got the words wrong there. So we would never present us and them kind of Or we would hope we never did. I mean, I'm sure we might sometimes slip into it, but that's certainly not our aim at all.
So the goal tonight would be that we'll probably go for about an hour, give you guys sort of a 5-minute break to make a cup of tea, and then go through till 8:30. The feedback we had last time was that during a masterclass, we've tried to play around because it's obviously different online than it is if you guys were here, how we'd run it. Normally here, as you know, we have an hour's group supervision at the end, which doesn't really work that well translated onto Zoom. The feedback was that during a sort of 2-hour masterclass, most people felt the time, and I relate to this from when we did the Deb Dana training, that the time of taking people into breakout rooms and coming back, they preferred to sort of hear the information and do question time. So sort of based on that, what we're going to do is sort of in about an hour, we'll have a think about your questions and sort of jot them down. We'll have one question time in about an hour, and we'll have another question time just sort of, 5 to 10 minutes before we finish. And then that way, anyone who wants to log off at the end can just log off then, and anyone who wants to stay around for questions can sort of stay around for that little bit of time as well.
And the only other thing that we always say is just take really good care of yourselves when we go through the data. As I said, we're all bozos on the bus together. That's a John Breer statement. No, I didn't make that up. But just take really good care of yourself. If there's stuff that's triggering you or upsetting you, or you need to be, in this space in a way that serves you, then we really value and honour that you take care of yourself in that.
Okay. This is our idea of a very good Zoom meeting that we would be having. You can see a number of people there. Sophie's in between Michelle Obama and Susan Sarandon.
Yeah, I have standards.
I've got Dolly, so I'm quite happy with that.
So look, you guys are all, you guys are pretty au fait with Zoom, but just to remind you that if Zoom freezes or drops out, just wait a couple of minutes. Hopefully we'll connect back in. Just mute yourself because the speaker view changes. And also if you have any difficulties, we've got you can ring Carolyn on the phone at Birch Tree or email through. Beautiful Carolyn's here to cover off all problems.
We also, it is being, if all else fails, it is being recorded, and you feel free to sit on a Saturday night with a recorded version of Jason and Sophie. I'm sure that would
if you're struggling with insomnia.
That would be great.
You'd fulfill Jason's fantasy, I'm sure.
Okay, so we start off with, we've got a couple of quotes and I put this one in actually because this is a quote that clients at Jarrah used to find really helpful. So that's just there. We won't go through all the quotes just because of time, but it's there for people if they wanted to sort of share that with clients. Okay, so just starting off, now you guys will have a book list, and so most of these, they should all be on there. But looking at what is addiction, so today there is going to be quite a lot, obviously, when we think of addiction, that we're talking about sort of drug and alcohol addiction, but you'll find as this goes on that this kind of goes over into everything from, gaming addiction's one we're seeing more at the moment, through to, I actually saw some data just now on mobile phone addiction and ACEs, which is quite interesting, through to kind of food addiction, in particular, the overeating end of, for people who use food kind of in a way with no purging or anything, that very much fits this same model. And so you'll find that sort of, I guess, most of it goes across. And the idea being that addiction is both a problem, but it's also a symptom. And that if we only focus on kind of just the sort of strategies around managing the addiction, we miss kind of the message, the unwritten message, kind of the implicit message that's sort of encompassed in the addiction. And, as Alice Miller says, it's in a language that actually tells us about a plight, that must be understood. And I would say that usually to clients as well. By the way, I often talk about this as a problem and a symptom, and that we're going to do a little bit because you have to give people some strategies. They want that. But at the same time, most people who come and have already tried that recognize if I don't do some of this, then I'm going to be kind of really stuck. Do you want to talk about Gabor?
Oh, Gabor. So if any of you know Kate Turner, she's ready to dump her husband and marry Gabor.
Yeah, she would.
Ready. So Gabor is he's a paediatrician, first with all the sort of psychiatry over trimmings in
Canada.
Canada, yes, thank you. I was going to put him in America. And he has written quite a few books on kind of this topic. He's a beautiful person. He left Budapest in Hungary just as the Nazis came in, and he went across to Canada as a refugee and talks a lot about his own story with addictions, as well as his own story about his childhood and the experiences of growing up in that way. And he, if you can get your hands on any of his, watch any YouTubes of his, he really kind of blew us away at the Australian Childhood Foundation Trauma Conference 2 years ago, and really kind of put into words beautifully the thoughts and the approaches that we had been taking with addictions. And, he's saying his approach is addiction's not your problem, it's an attempt to solve your problem.
We'll talk a little bit more about him sort of throughout tonight as well. He also, by the way, I've often given clients, he's got a website that has on his website, which is something like gaboulmate.com, don't quote me, it's something like that. But it's got everything from his audio visual to his to podcasts he's been on, to the books he's written, to articles he's written. So it's kind of like all in one place. So it's quite good. And yes, Kate Turner thinks he's really hot. Okay, so what we're going to start off with, because we thought where do we go with this? Like, how do we start this? And we thought, well, we kind of need to look at what are the paradigms of addiction? So what is it that we're working on? Where's it come from? All of these paradigms, I just want to say, by the way, are still currently in some form in the world. You will find all of these paradigms still. None of them are completely kind of wiped out. And to be honest, in Australia, I think you'd find most of these in existence as well.
And the paradigms very much direct the way in which addictions were treated, or the government's approach and law and legislation to addictions. So that's why it's really important to kind of understand the different steps that we've taken across the years.
Absolutely. And we're not going to come down and say, having worked in, like I've worked in home detox, methadone, liaison drug and alcohol, inpatient, outpatient rehab, across the kind of spectrum. Methadone units are like working in a bar. It's quite funny. You keep doing shot glasses and just, handing them over.
Except you have to go to the toilet with your patients.
But, and I would definitely say that I don't hold any of, I think the reality, and you'll find this as we go on, is that it's quite complex. And the complexities of it, I don't think any kind of one paradigm or one lens or one sort of treatment model in themselves. I think that every person who's working and every person who's struggling is going to see different aspects of these. What I would say is these shape the lens that we look at someone through. And it's really worth thinking as well, growing up, because some of that, as we all know, I mean, Yolande talks a lot about this, whatever lens drug and alcohol was given in our own childhood, that lens is going to be pretty dominant when we walk in the room with someone in full-blown addiction. And so which of these might ring true kind of for you, I guess we'd say.
So essentially, in terms of approaching drugs and alcohol, the first sort of obvious paradigm in which governments got involved was around the sort of paradigm where the drugs themselves are inherently addictive and problematic, and that therefore we must get rid of all of them. And so this is quite a different paradigm to kind of the harm minimisation approach that we run today. And they did call prohibition in America the noble experiment of, and we've all seen videos of, or in movies of, casks of wine being broken open and tipped out down the street.
Sophie, that was your home video. But
that was, I was there with the bath trying to catch it. Oh no. But, and the aim was, and because there was such a black market, as soon as you prohibit anything, there's a huge black market that can sort of, bounce back from it. And this arose, we know from the opium dens around the gold rush, through the late 19th century with the gold rush and the opium dens. And so it was kind of the government's approach to actually try and resolve the difficulties around addiction, was to take a really strong-armed, very rigid black and white strong-armed approach.
Which is still, when you think about how that implies now, in the US in particular, which is very, very tough criminalisation, that whole 3 strikes and you're out. So you can be caught kind of with some marijuana. If it's your 3rd strike, you're in jail for years over there. And what they've actually found, they've done studies which have shown, looking at, compared to Europe, where there's often a lot more of a relaxed kind of approach around drugs, is there a difference in how many people are at, does it work? So does this kind of really tough approach work? And they did a huge study in the States to explore this. And actually, the US rate of sort of illicit drug use is 4 times higher than it is even with the kind of knowing. So knowing that there are those criminal sort of, what you call it, sanctions, do you know what I mean, around that, doesn't seem to affect whether or not people will pick up a drug. And if you think about it, given that when you're using drugs, the consequential thinking is offline, then it kind of makes sense that if I'm not going to be thinking in consequential thinking, I'm not going to really worry about that.
Then we've got Nancy Reagan. So Nancy Reagan's quite responsible for the people are making a choice to use drugs. And so if you just simply say no, then there'll be, well, why would we have any more drugs? And so really the just say no paradigm turned into a moral failing or a weakness within the individual around addiction. And if you've worked with anybody, I've got a client who is 40, like early 40s, who's was an injecting drug user, and very much her approach to herself and the messaging she got in the 90s around her drug use was that she was a failure of moral kind of standing. And so, you know, because their sort of approach was that people choose their behaviour, we have to kind of, you know, really get quite penal on them. And, you know, as we know, and as what Jay said, that it's so much more complex than that. But this is really, if you have anybody who's 40 and older who has a drug habit or had a drug habit, this will be very, very prominent from the late 80s. Because I think, Nancy, this was around 87, was it around this?
It is, but it's not. The interesting thing is, if you look at now, so the Just Say No sort of, well, it was adverts, it was bumper stickers, the whole thing at the time, rose into what they called the DARE program. And you might have actually done that yourself growing up. It's drug abuse resistance education. And that is currently in 75% of all US schools, and it's in 46 countries currently. And that is based on this notion of kind of teaching. The DARE program is around, you go into the classroom, they see you for a few months, they come in and out, and they teach you how to say no and how to deal with peer pressure. But it's very much seen as in that there's this kind of, otherwise you could turn into someone kind of really scary. The interesting thing about the DARE program is the Just Say No from Nancy Reagan is very focused on illicit drug use. But what they actually found in studies is teenagers who engaged in the DARE program actually had a higher rate of smoking and alcohol use, because it was sort of separated where this stuff is really bad and really scary, and this stuff is it's almost sanctioned and okay. And so it, you know, in that sense, that's kind of one of the difficulties, but that is again still out there currently.
I remember the drug education that we had here growing up, and if you round down, I'm the early 40s because I'm in the mid-range, and we had it was very much the one hit and you're hooked around heroin as well, which was around the drug itself is the issue, and if you just never go near it, you'll never have a problem. And then we've kind of had this more recent late 90s kind of the medical, the disease model of addiction. And this is when, of course, you know, we've got the burgeoning of genetics, genetic kind of studies as well around maybe it's a disease of the brain. We started to see that there were high correlates between having a parent with an addiction and then having an addiction yourself. And this sort of research was coming out before we had epigenetics. So, you know, epigenetics is when you have the presence of the gene, but you need the environment to turn the gene on and off. And we know epigenetics is far more the case for anything that's genetically loaded than, you know, having a gene itself. But a lot of this research started to sort of say, well, you know, I've got an addictive personality, I've got the addiction gene, lots of people in my family are addicts, without really taking into account maybe there's a whole bunch of reasons around why there's addiction in that family that aren't related to genetics. And so people would sort of say things like, I've got the bad DNA. And this is, you know, this is very much, I mean, the 12-step program was started in 1954, is that right? With two fellas. You talk about it better than I do, the 12-step program.
There's a very good movie. Well, look, I've seen the movie 2,056 times working in rehab. It's called Anonymous Hero, and it's about how Bill and Bob, who started the 12-step, kind of met. And they were both doctors who were struggling with their own alcoholism and found they'd gone and tried the current kind of treatments of the time and hadn't found any help. And they just started talking together and found that actually being with someone else in the struggle was really helping. And that kind of gradually built into the kind of 12-step program, which is one of the, without any doubt, worldwide dominant kind of paradigms for, interestingly, 12-step, and I think this is important to point out, 12-step was never developed as treatment, it was developed as a support mechanism. And sometimes it can be misconstrued, and it's just when you go right back to the reasons it was originally developed, it was sort of for that. The other thing about 12-step is officially in rehabs and things, you're not meant to teach the steps unless you yourself are a member of the fellowship. But again, that doesn't always play out. I think that sort of, you know, the interesting thing is there's been advantages and disadvantages to this sort of disease model, or dis-ease, as AA often calls it. One of them is that it actually sort of started to move it into looking at health, as opposed to, because prior to that, a lot of that prohibition, criminalisation, just then, it was very much looking at the legal kind of side of how to manage it. It also reduces shame, because people sort of can see, okay, you know, it's not something that I don't, you know, it's not something that is my fault as such. And it also kind of allows kind of a treatment approach that does work for some people. Abstinence is, I mean, AA is very much abstinence-based.
All the A's.
But the same advantages can also be disadvantages. So abstinence doesn't work for everybody, we know that, and you know what I mean, some people do need to sort of look at harm minimisation. And the same thing about, if you see it's not my fault, but it sometimes doesn't also then lead to someone taking responsibility. I would say for family, it's interesting, again, it's a mixed blessing for family, because I think if you look at it as genetic, then it sometimes takes the focus off some of the systemic issues in a family that actually need to be addressed. Because they can say, well, Pete's like that because, you know, he's got the gene and he's an alcoholic, and as opposed to looking at some of the environment that might have been at play as well. So
yeah, and look, methadone maintenance comes from this model in terms of, so what they showed via autopsies was really when people who were heroin users, when they autopsied, they showed high upregulation of opioid receptors within the brain. And so they kind of said, well, the brain changes and never changes back again. And so the only really safe thing to do is to do a methadone maintenance kind of approach to this, this kind of space. And so I think this is where we're still sort of sitting. One thing I did want to say is in 1998, there was a huge randomised controlled trial. What was it called? It's called Project Match, and it's a randomised multi-site trial where they basically randomise people to either like a 12-step program, interpersonal therapy, or a classic kind of CBT, a program for addictions, and for alcohol addiction, sorry. And what they found, there's thousands of people participating, and everybody had their kind of manual about how you do the different types of therapy. And what they showed was equal efficacy across all the different treatment modalities for addiction in that really big study. And it kind of, at that point, I was working in drug and alcohol, it kind of blew the world apart, not the world, it blew the geeky research treatment world apart because people were being very adversarial about who had the better treatment. You know, was it motivational interviewing versus 12-step versus this versus that? And really 12-step, because it's so long-term and it's not that easy to randomise people to 12-step or not, it's really a difficult, 12-step doesn't have the level of evidence that other short-term interventions have. Points to ponder, Jace.
So these are some questions that come out of the paradigms that hopefully we will start to kind of, I don't think we will come up, I think these are ongoing questions in this work, but they're questions that we will kind of put some sort of ideas about as we continue. But one is, so are the changes, so we can all agree there are changes in the addicted brain, we know that now, but are they purely the consequence of drug use? Or is the brain of the habitual user somehow susceptible before drug use began, and therefore sort of that person turns to drug use? And the other sort of question that comes out of it is, are there brain states that predispose the person to become addicted? And is this because of, so is it genetic inheritance? Is it life experience? Is it a combination? And how does that kind of, and is it different person to person? So is there an answer that applies across the board, or is the uniqueness, just as it is with trauma, where everybody's coming with their own unique story, is there a uniqueness where we can't say it's necessarily, for this person it might be, you know, this and this, and for this person it might look quite different?
So I guess one of the things that we have to kind of address in this space initially, and I'll get much more into kind of the neurobiology of addiction, is that all addictions share, you know, we've got some very basic brain, well, they're not basic, they're amazingly intricate, but the same brain circuits in everybody's brain participate in the space of addiction. And so at a biochemical kind of level, whatever you do, the whole point of drugs is to have a mind altering experience. And so we are going to have different kind of, you know, we might be having a go at the dopamine, or we might be going for, you know, serotonin if you're taking MDMA, and that will affect and work on everybody, because we all are working with the same kind of brain or neurobiology that we evolved to have. The thing is that different people will be susceptible in different kind of ways.
Okay. One thing about addiction that might be helpful, because I found this is just kind of comes from working on the wards with it a lot, but if you think about, people often say, well, what does withdrawal look like? How do I know if someone I'm seeing is kind of in withdrawal? Withdrawal is always the opposite to whatever the drug does. So if alcohol is a depressant on your system, then the withdrawal, when you measure on an alcohol withdrawal scale, you're measuring things like a tremor, anxiety, agitation, you know,
stimulation.
The heart rate, there's 7 points to the hallucination. Anyway, there's 7 points on your alcohol withdrawal scale that you're looking at. And similarly, if you take speed, what does speed do? It speeds everything up, obviously. What's the withdrawal? The withdrawal will be you crash. And so that can help. The other thing that can also help is having some idea of how long a drug stays in your system, to know that is what the person's going through at the moment a result of still having a lot of the drug in their system, or is this actually much more on the psychological kind of side of things, and actually the drug has now left their system? So I just thought I'd say that. Okay, so when we want to talk a little bit about moving into kind of the idea of, is it environment, how does environment play a role in addiction? There's a study that came to be in the sort of 1970s, Bruce Alexander. Prior to, so Rat Park study, for some of you, I'm sure have already heard of this, and some probably this will be new information. Prior to sort of, before Rat Park study came about, the idea was, as we said earlier, that drugs are just kind of inherently addictive. You know, that whole, Sophie was saying, one shot and you're hooked, that sort of sense. And so in other words, if I came up to you, it's that whole idea of, gosh, if a drug kind of lord came and captured you and started to give you heroin, you would be addicted. It's that idea. I don't think the drug lord would want to give you all his heroin, but
unless you're selling it for him. That's one of the things that they do.
So what happened is Bruce Alexander sort of was starting to think, well, I don't know that things are as simple as that. And because he was had mostly been a lab psychologist at the time, he changed as his career went on. He started to think about the rats that he was working with and thought, okay, well, maybe we can start off by doing a study around rats. So what he found was, traditionally at that time in the sort of 1960s, 70s, rats in the labs were kept in solitary confinement. So this here is a Skinner box.
Okay, that's the one on the right. She's pointing to the screen. She's pointing to the screen like you can see.
Okay, the one on the right is a Skinner box where you can see it's one box. And at that, when the rat is in that, they cannot see any other rat at all. They can't, there's no sort of, they can't touch, they can't interact. And in the Skinner box, they found they were doing research at the time where they would have both sort of clear liquid dripped into the Skinner box. One would be full of sort of a morphine heroin kind of, substitute, and one here would be full of water. And then the idea was, let's just see, what do the rats, what do they do? And over time, what would happen is the rats would obviously start to go towards the drug, and then as they started to use the drug more and more, they would more and more and more sort of just tap on that. And basically they continued to do that until they overdosed and died. which was not, it was a bit of a sad
So
end.
they sort of pressed it, so they were able to press the lever and receive a dose at their own sort of volition. And this was kind of their way of using the argument that the drugs themselves are inherently addictive. One thing that's really important, if any of you have ever had surgery, then you have already had a drug of addiction, which is morphine, there's actually a really great conversations, Richard Feidler's Conversations on ABC. He actually has a podcast on the history of heroin. It's really, and opium, it's really interesting. And so it's kind of this concept that if it was inherently addictive, then why haven't we, who've all had surgery and had morphine, come out with an addiction that you know of? No, I'm just kidding.
So what Bruce Alexander thought is, look, maybe, hypothesis, it wasn't actually the drug, it was the fact that they were in a very boring, closed off kind of Skinner box, which allowed them very little free space because, as he said, rats are naturally sort of playful and kind of social creatures, and they didn't have access to that. So what would happen then if we took rats and put them in a kind of amazing, he called it it was called Rat Park, but it was like a rat kind of wonderland, where you can see pictures of it here. It was 200 times the space normally, and they had access to mating. They had access to kind of, I don't know if they really loved the Colombian forest.
I think they like the Colombian forest, so cute.
And they had sort of access to things of playing as well, like you can see them sort of running around, and it was sort of basically set up that it would have everything that they might need. But in exactly the same way, we will give them access to both water and the morphine water, and we will allow free choice and just see what actually happens.
So the idea of the rat wonderland was really that they gave them the environment that rats would thrive in. So there's plenty of food, plenty of water, plenty of space, plenty of other rats, and lots of fun, stimulating things for them to do.
Okay. So the results were, so they compared them to the rats that were in the Skinner boxes, that Rat Park rats consistently basically went towards the plain water. The caged rats ingested at least 19 times more morphine water than Rat Park rats, and that even the rats in cages that were fed nothing at all but morphine water for 57 days chose plain water. In other words, they detoxed themselves. They went to rehab. They detoxed themselves when they got into Rat Park and went, well, this place is pretty good. I need to not be out of it. And so they voluntarily went through withdrawal. And no matter what they tried, they couldn't make the addiction in rats they couldn't create any form of addiction in the rats that were actually housed in the Rat Park.
So this was kind of research that really blew them away in terms of their assumptions that the drug itself is inherently addictive.
This is also in thinking about this, he brought sort of analogies around Vietnam vets and said, well, this is where we know that, for example, Vietnam vets were much more likely when they were actually in Vietnam in the height of the war, in trauma, that they were using a lot of heroin. We know that on return to, he was talking about in return to the States, that when they returned back, that for the majority of them in a different environment, they didn't actually continue the addiction that they had had in Vietnam. Just wanting to point out, there was a couple of problems with Rat Park, because we don't want to put this over as say, well, so this is kind of it. With all of this, the whole goal of tonight is to be able to think and look at it. One of the problems that's considered is that in the Rat Park, they were allowed to mate. So they had males and females, and they were allowed to mate, and therefore there were a lot of Rat Park babies that were created. And whether or not there was an element of that, and it wasn't just kind of the environment is something that's considered. The other thing is they've tried to replicate the Rat Park study a number of times and have never got quite such strong results as happened sort of that first time.
I think it's the British Columbia trees on the sides that must have been the difference. So in terms of relating this to humans, I guess really the take-home message for all of us is that humans don't need to be kind of physically isolated. We know that actually it's quite difficult to live as a physically isolated human in modern living. to become addicted to substances. But what we really want to think about is the emotional isolation. And actually, in one of the emails we sent out this week, there was a meme which is emotional isolation is really the absence of having anybody that you can tell the true insights of your experience to. And that, you know, really in terms of application to humans, is that the human cage might be, you know, invisible, but it's still no less there. And one of the things that Bruce Alexander turned to was really sort of anthropology and the effect of colonisation across the world, of really essentially white people over brown people across the world, people of any colour, skin of colour. And what he sort of started to talk about was, in fact, you know, if you look at the research prior to colonisation, there aren't high rates of addiction in different countries where people were colonised. In fact, there was a really, and Bruce Alexander's work, we're coming to it. Not Bruce Alexander, Bruce Pascoe. I knew I was saying that wrong. Bruce Pascoe's book Dark Emu is all about the archaeology of Indigenous life in Australia prior to colonisation, and the evidence of, you know, permanent dwellings of 300 odd people with their own system of land and government, with agriculture, with aquaculture, permanent agriculture and aquaculture. And what really people, Bruce Alexander and Bruce Pascoe, are really sort of saying is that colonisation saw the destruction of the rat park. We say that with full respect, that, you know, obviously it's not a rat park, but that's Bruce Alexander's version of it. That the destruction of the beautiful environment that people were living in harmoniously, you know, in Australia for over 60,000 years. And then the destruction of, you know, family systems, you know, the destruction, the genocide practiced, or the complete wipeout of particular levels of generational levels of people who held all these sort of information and held the law, particularly in Aboriginal people in Australia, really led to the destruction of connection and closeness to all of the things that made life worth living for them before white people came to Australia or Canada or America. And, you know, like there was a very strong hypothesis back in the 80s around Indigenous people in Australia that they didn't produce enough alcohol dehydrogenase in their liver, and they were more susceptible to becoming drunk than white people were. And that was a really strong message that was around the late 80s, early 90s. For anybody who grew up in Australia, I remember that message. And that was sort of like an explanation about not being able to hold their drink, without really realising that white person came and destroyed all of their culture, you know, raped women and killed the men in the culture. So I think it's we kind of raise that because I think sometimes we, as a society, often blame the addict or blame the victim in the space, but in fact, actually, there's a lot of responsibility that we all need to hold in this.
Okay, so if we take that then further and we say, well, let's explore kind of the impact of what happens when your own rat park, you know, in the ideal kind of environment is not there, how does that then sort of relate to addiction? And what we know is, I mean, for people who, we're not going to go right through the ACE study because I know most of you have already done that sort of in the past, but ACEs are basically adverse childhood experiences, and the current ACE study says there's 10 of them. New kind of things would add a few extra to that. But the idea of sort of the relationship, that dose-response relationship that is there, is that there's huge now studies that tell us that as you increase in ACEs, you similarly increase in risk factors towards sort of addiction, alcoholism.
Every single health outcome that the government measures, you actually, if the more ACEs you have, the higher the risk you are in that particular outcome. And so kind of what Peter Fonagy, who's in the last point, the third point on this slide, what really people like Peter Fonagy and other people are proposing is that adverse childhood experiences don't cause one particular addiction to, you know, cannabis versus this, you know, this adverse childhood experience will make you more prone to heroin. Is that it causes non-specific neurodevelopment disruption, which then leads to particular uptake of addictions based upon sometimes just accessibility as well. And so, so you kind of, he suggested this concept called a general psychopathology factor, or a P factor, that people would load highly on in terms of not being able like load highly on in terms of just general kind of dysfunction, hate that word, sorry, general kind of difficulties with getting on with everyday life, but then have their specific version of it. So if you flip that around, that's a little bit like Jason and I saying that every single time we worked with someone with eating disorders or somebody with addiction, we kept hearing childhood trauma at the bottom of that. So he's kind of flipping that around the other way. I think there's a really important caveat that I just want to add into talking about ACEs, which is new, and I'm going to surprise Jace because she doesn't know I'm going to say this. One of the things about ACEs is I think the ACE research is ACE, sorry, that's a very Victorian thing to say, having lived in Melbourne for many years. It's really great for working with adults who have childhood experiences of trauma, because what we do is we demystify why they're struggling to function in today's, day-to-day life, right? But if you're working with kids who are currently living with multiple ACEs, there in England in particular, there's this kind of subculture of clinical approaches, which is, well, that person's got lots of ACEs, so they're just going to have a terrible future, so there's nothing we can do about it. So there's actually a bit of sort of throwing up hands in the air and a really big pushback from people about using ACEs as a prospective model to determine what futures would occur. And there's quite a big pushback on that. And I would agree with that, because as we know, the brain changes and lots of amazing things can happen, and sometimes the right person can come in and be there for a child and change things up. So when we talk about ACEs, what we're really talking about is the utility of understanding that as an adult, the way you function today makes so much sense if I know about your past.
So looking at one of the areas, and they've done, you can find studies on pretty much any form of addiction, but one of them, that relates sort of in particular tonight, looking at the illicit drug use kind of scores and correlated with ACE scores, what they found is every ACE increases the likelihood for early initiation before the age of 15 by 2 to 4 times. Now, the importance of that is, I would say that if anyone before the age 15 is going down an illicit drug use, it will automatically tell you there are ACEs there. Like if you look at your average kind of 13, 14-year-old out there, they would have not come anywhere near an illicit drug in their life. And so these are also we can use them as red flags as, okay, that's interesting. If someone coming to see me is starting to tell me about that, that's telling me a lot about that they probably would have a number of ACEs there. The other thing, the ACE score has a strong kind of graded relationship. So not just to the initiation of drug use, but also to all drug use problems, drug addiction, and interestingly, to parental drug use. So it tells us that the more ACEs that you have, the more likely it is that one or other or both of your parents will also be scoring highly on illicit drug use, this is, by the way. And the other thing is, compared with people who don't have any ACEs, people with more than 5 ACEs are 7 to 10 times more likely to report illicit drug use problems, addiction, and parental drug use. So I guess what this tells us is, if you think about Rat Park, that, look, the more kind of struggles, the more kind of ACEs that you actually have, we do know that, yes, absolutely, there is a link, clearly, of environment with kind of the idea of going down certain sort of tracks of addiction. You can talk about the...
do you mean this quote, or do you mean... I was going to go on to my stats. I wanted to show you the stats the next. Okay, so this is actually the stats. So when I was working at the Children's Hospital in Melbourne, I worked in epidemiology, and we did all these odds ratios, and you get really, really excited when you get odds ratios like this, because you never actually get them in research very often. But essentially what this showed was you've got your ACEs down the left-hand side of this table, and then you've kind of got your smoking, alcoholism, illicit drug use, and addiction across the top. And so there's your odds ratios there, that if you have 4 or more ACEs, that you have for alcoholism 7.2 times more likely to suffer from alcoholism than if you have 3 or less. So that's the comparison. And the same for illicit drug use and injecting drug use. You've got 11 times more likely if you have 4 or more ACEs. Now, one of the difficulties that I think is always really important to talk about, and I will talk about the early sexual intercourse because it's such an interesting part of this as well, but one of the difficulties that oh gosh, I forgot what I was going to say because my mind jumped across to early intercourse. Let me talk about that, and then let's see if my dementia will give me back what I was going to talk about as well. In terms of early intercourse, it's really interesting that there is this kind of ratio for early onset, and that's what I was going to say. One of the things that we need to remember with ACEs is that the likelihood of having 4 ACEs or more means that you've kind of likely to have probably DV in the space, possibly somebody with incarceration, so a parent who's been incarcerated. We've kind of got, some of the issues of, it's a term called polyvictimhood, which I think is a horrible term, but what it really suggests is that if you've got a few ACEs, you're likely to have a whole lot more ACEs as well. Because if you've got a parent who's gone to jail, then you've got less monitoring and less safety at home. You're likely to have a parent, if that parent's gone to jail for domestic violence, you've got another increased rate of possibly having more domestic violence in the home. We know that sexual abuse by a father to a mother and domestic violence by a father to a mother greatly increases the chance of that child being sexually abused or physically abused as well. And so once we get above this sort of 4 ratio, what you see is that people tend to have lots of ACEs together. And if you think about your clients, it wouldn't be unusual for you to think, well, actually, I've probably got clients who have 6, 7 and 8 ACEs rather than only 4. So they can sometimes fall into 2 camps. The early intercourse part is also the early initiation of sex is also related to overexposure to the adult world. So overexposure to parents who might be having sex, or overexposure to porn, or lack of safety in a home, lack of parents who actually monitor and keep a child safe as well. And so that's kind of why we see those rates around sexuality as well. So essentially, one of the things that started to be looked at is really the changes, the impact of ACEs on neurobiology. One of the awesome things is that all of this neurobiology that we're talking about here is plastic and malleable and changeable. And so when we talk with clients about this, we might recognise it with clients, but then we would always say, but this isn't locked in stone and hardwired into you for the rest of your life. That there's actually a lot going on that we can actually change and work with. So let me start with the HPA axis dysregulation. At this point, those of you who hated neuroscience will probably glaze over and curse me. So I won't try not to make it too long. But really what we want to know, what we sort of want to pull together is that if you've had a kid who hasn't had the benefit or the fortune of being able to grow up in a rat park, then there's going to be changes in their neurobiology, which are they'll have an irritable HPA axis, they'll have a reduced number of sort of opioid and dopamine receptors in their brain, they'll have a permanent decrease in their production of oxytocin and chronically high levels of cortisol.
I'm going to give you this quote because this is actually a really good quote from Bruce Perry. He says, a child who is stressed early in life will be more overreactive and reactive. He is triggered more easily, is more anxious and distressed. Now compare a person, child, adolescent or adult, whose baseline arousal is normal with another whose baseline state of arousal is at a higher level. Give them both alcohol. So you think about your teenage parties here, okay? Like think about the clients you have who are teenagers. They're coming in, they've got different baseline states of arousal. They go off to a party and they're both given alcohol. Both may experience the same intoxicating effect, but the one who has this higher physiological arousal will have the added effect of feeling pleasure from the relief of that stress. It's similar to when, with a parched throat, you drink some cool water. The pleasure effect is much heightened by the relief of thirst.
Okay, don't glaze over. Okay, do glaze over. I know there's some other neuro geeks out there with me who enjoy this sort of stuff. This is probably one of the best and most accessible articles on HPA axis dysregulation. So the HPA axis starts with your hypothalamus at the top, which then connects to your pituitary gland, which then connects to your adrenal. So we're going kind of, I didn't realise until I listened to Stephen Porges' wife today that the hypothalamus is one of the oldest structures of the brain that starts off the whole kind of stress response. So your HPA axis is what is in charge of your stress response. So in your brain, the hypothalamus starts to trigger off the pituitary gland to release CRF. CRF is called releasing factor, corticosteroid releasing factor. And what it does is it kind of, in our brain we have all the kind of different messengers. So it sends a messenger to the pituitary gland, which then releases adrenocorticotropic hormone, which then goes down to the adrenal gland, which then releases all the corticoids, which of course cortisone is the major one. Okay, there you go. I did that quite well, didn't I? There is a feedback loop from our gut. So, we have lots of what Jace would love to do, if she just did a demonstration on the screen then. She'd love to be on the board doing the lovely, the lovely demonstration. You have a feedback loop. So you have lots and lots of cortisol receptors in your gut and a feedback loop. So as your gut detects what cortisol you have in there, it tells the brain, stop making so much cortisol. We're going to use it all, or keep making more cortisol. So you've got this lovely suppressant loop. So if you go brain, hypothalamus, pituitary, down to adrenals, that's all go, 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 go. And then you've kind of got these feedback loops, which are like slow down, slow down, slow down. And so what happens is that, and a lot of this research comes out of the Romanian orphanages. So in the 80s, the government outlawed contraception and didn't actually offer any support to families who kept having lots and lots of children, and so children were being abandoned and raised in orphanages. What I didn't know until I was listening, there's lots of research about it, and the videos around the Romanian orphanages are incredibly heartbreaking. But what they did was they actively tried not to let the babies attach to any one person. So they would rotate, they did no physical contact, and they would rotate the workers so that not the same worker didn't, keep looking after the baby, which now what we understand about attachment is just so incredibly heartbreaking. What happened was, huge neurodevelopmental difficulties, but what they really were able to show was this complete HPA axis dysregulation. Where an absence of kind of social connection and safety and nurturance and oxytocin has led to this HPA system, which just pings off immediately. So, our clients, it's like having a high startle and then times that by 100, where the body's always doused in cortisol and always doused in kind of reactivity, and the feedback loop isn't working. And so the body remains in this high stress state. So that's this HPA axis dysregulation that you get from growing up in dangerous environments or social poverty, social connection poverty. Now, so that's your defence system, your reactive defence system, but then we've kind of got the opioid reward system where we want to receive lovely opioids, and that sense of feeling really, really loved comes from the opioid system. And what's really interesting, and it was only after seeing Gabor Mate and then reflecting back on this client of mine who's been an injecting drug user, that Gabor Mate said that for his clients who had been heroin users, they all reported that the experience of heroin was like being back in the mother's arms. It was a sense of safe, warm, secure attachment at a very, very primal baby kind of level. And I reflected about a client of mine whose mum died when she was 6 months old. And then she ended up being a heroin user from 15 onwards. And I have shared that with her a lot because she does a lot of moral judgment of herself. She does a lot of that ingrained moral judgment of herself being a user. And I keep saying, but it would make sense that you would choose that drug because you had such a broken attachment in your childhood with this absence of a mother who died when she was 6 months old. I think one of the things, you want to talk to that point?
That the difficulty is that if you think about sort of the circuit that happens, you end up with, so that what we're saying is, okay, say there's been isolation in some way, shape or form that tips someone into, like Sophie's client, into going to finding sort of a drug that helps in a way provide what isn't getting provided by the environment. The difficulty is where people get caught in a circuit is that then the addiction itself leads to further isolation because you disconnect from people, and as the addiction continues, it further feeds that circuit and therefore the need for the drug. So that isolation is both kind of, in a way, a causal kind of, one of the kind of not the only, but one of the precipitating, but it's also a maintaining factor very much. And that's one of the things, if you think about where does 12-step come in, 12-step actually, one of the big things 12-step provides is it breaks down the isolation, is it allows someone to walk in a room with people who get it, who are attuned and can connect in and share a story in the same way as a kind of, you know, a trauma support group does. And another way is I'm not, that thing of I am not alone here. And gradually as they start to build up that, there's less need to necessarily receive that from the drug.
Yeah. And so what we've seen in terms of the opioid system as well is that emotional pain has been found by Eisenberger and Liebner, these two amazing people at UCLA, have showed time and time again with fMRI, so that's functional MRI machines, that we experience physical pain and social pain in the same parts of our bodies. So it's not body, in the same part of our brain. So that's the a part of your anterior cingulate. So it's part of your limbic system. One of the things that they also showed was that, so basically they put people into functional MRI, they induce some pain, this part of the anterior cingulate kind of lights up and gets all upset. They then get people back in the MRI and then they socially exclude them in a game where they're throwing a ball. It's a game called Cyber Catch, and you're supposed to throw the ball. And the person in the MRI doesn't know that this is all set up. And so they start to watch these other people in the these other people in the computer game throw the ball between each other, and they get left out. And what they showed was that the same area in the brain that had lit up when they did some, you know, they poked them with a pin, lit up for social exclusion as well. And so what we're really saying is that the experience of social isolation and lack of social connection is experienced as like a physical pain. And there is some research where they gave people Panadol. So remember, Panadol's in the opioid system. They gave people Panadol when they'd had a social exclusion, and in fact, people did report feeling better after having it. One of the, there's our two areas. I was going to point at the screen as well. I'll stop teasing you about that. So on the left-hand side, you've got the anterior cingulate, the dorsal anterior cingulate, DACC. That's where it really kind of goes off in terms of the pain network. One of the really interesting parts of their research that I was reading about also showed that the ability to manage physical pain and social pain is located in your prefrontal cortex. Now, that's not going to surprise any of us because that's how we use our clever brains to down-regulate. But what they showed is that the pain lights up in that dorsal anterior cingulate, and then the other part of the area, the prefrontal cortex, starts to light up as well. And what it's doing is an inhibitory response to the dorsal anterior cingulate. So it's trying to calm down where the pain, social or physical, is being experienced. And so what they've shown is that people who, we know that drug and alcohol use causes major difficulties in prefrontal cortex development if you start too young, so if you're starting below 15 years of age, and also causes difficulties in blood flow and even just, you know, repetition of use to grow that part of your brain. So what you have is a system that is highly attuned to physical pain, highly attuned to social pain and exclusion, and yet also can't soothe itself because the prefrontal cortex isn't quite doing the level of job that it would do in a person who hadn't had that childhood experience. And one of the interesting things when I worked with the homeless community in King's Cross here was people would bust, they would go clean, clean, clean on heroin, and then they would bust, and we'd go like, so tell me why you used, and we'd think there was some big major issue, and they would say, I had a headache and I couldn't cope. And it was that sort of thing where they become highly sensitized to pain, and then nothing feels like it's going to work like heroin does. And one of the things this client of mine have been talking about is she's so shitty with me when I recommend things that she could do, which will be soft and subtle, because she's so used to the big, large wipeout effect of heroin. And she and I often talk about that because she's a little bit like, nah, your fucking group's stupid and I'm not going to do it. And Jace knows this person. So Jace is laughing because I just did a good role play of her. But she'll often tell me off. because she wants it to work like heroin. And so that is part of what she and I have to work on together, which is when you're coming off something that works so well, nothing's going to work as well as that.
So we might just do this one and then we'll take a 5-minute sort of break just for people to grab a cup of tea or go to the bathroom.
You talk to this.
So taking this then into kind of going, okay, if we go back to kind of, you know, rats research and what else is there that tells us about this, tells us about the impact in a way of ACEs, you could say, and social bonding and the need for social connection. What they found is that, so rat pups who were their mother, taken away from their mother and present for just 1 hour a day during their first week of life, grew up much more eager than their peers to take cocaine when it was offered to them. And so that simply 1 hour of their day was enough that they ended up as really sort of, you know, significant. And that tells us that it's not, they weren't even removed sort of permanently, but that, you know, you start to then think about kind of, okay, that's interesting with some of the other studies, you know, around humans and how long away, when do you hit that threshold, I guess is what brings up that question. The other thing is that rats that are socially isolated, so at 21 days old, they took these rats and isolated them from their peers. And again, these were much more, this adolescence, by the way, is 21 days old for a rat. They don't tend to live very long, especially not if they're at UNSW. They probably don't have adolescence there.
Level 5.
I saw many of them. That they were more vulnerable to addiction, also to amphetamines and alcohol, and that they only needed to have one exposure and they continually went to that. So, and the other thing was when they tried to detox them, the socially isolated rats didn't want to. And that, you know, I have to say, having worked in rehab for years, that would definitely be the case. It's like, why would I come off alcohol if I've got nothing else?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, you'd be talking to people and they'd be like, but love, I haven't got any, you know, this is what I have, and so I'm not going to give it up. And that part of the goal for us was very much building social networks. So what I want to talk about, when we're talking about dopamine, this was something in rehab that we used to talk to people about, and I have used this with pretty much everybody that I see with addiction. I would go through this. And it's a way of explaining to them why they might sort of struggle early on with giving up, and it relates to kind of dopamine addiction. So if you talk to someone about, look at this, by the way, just watch this. If you start off and you have, you know, a certain amount of dopamine floating around the system, and I would say to clients, this is kind of, you know, it's the neurotransmitter that helps you feel kind of those good feelings, a sense of joy. Then what happens is the person comes along and they find a drug and they take the drug and they get what's called a dopamine surge. So suddenly there's a huge amount of dopamine floating around the system, and the person goes from feeling sort of good, you know, normal sort of levels of dopamine, to feeling great. And they think, wow, that was awesome. I would like to do that again. So they go along and they find the drug again. And so as you can see, they continually sort of form these dopamine surges. Then what happens is that because of the fact that the body, you know, your brain is pretty smart and it basically adapts to the environment and says, do you know what, if you're going to continually give me sort of these dopamine surges, I will shut down half the receptor sites for dopamine, and I will also shut down half the production of dopamine. So what that means is there's less dopamine floating around the system overall, and there's less receptor sites for the bit that is floating around to be uptake. The end result of that is, once you continue using sort of your drug, your baseline level of dopamine drops to about there. Then what happens is you take a drug and you go from feeling, so down here you feel pretty crap, you know, you feel, life feels very, often people would say it feels very grey, it's very boring, it's very bland. Sometimes it can be like a depression, but it's more that sort of general, don't have any energy, any motivation for anything. Then they take the drug and you do still get a dopamine surge, but because of the reduced receptor sites and the reduced amount, you go from feeling pretty yuck to just feeling normal. You no longer feel great. And that's why with addiction, as people keep using it, you're searching for this, but your brain's never going to let you get back to that. It keeps you down here, so you continually get these. Then what happens is you go along and say, okay, I really need to give up the drug. It's not working for me anymore. The difficulty is it takes 2 years for your dopamine levels to fully go back up from the base up to here. And so this is one of the reasons why in those first couple of years, that's where things like DBT skills and things can actually be quite useful here, because it's really worth letting people, we used to talk to them a lot about when people sort of come off drugs, they'll just say life is so boring without a drugs. God, I go to a party and it's so boring. And it's now part of that. If they understand this, and if you have a template for, okay, I get that this is what my brain is doing, that then it makes sense that you're going to be sort of in this place. The other thing that's worth saying is there will be an automatic pull at a very subconscious level to go for anything that will give you a dopamine spike. And so that would mean, say someone comes to rehab and they're coming and they're detoxing from alcohol. Suddenly they're eating tons of chocolate, they're drinking, and I kid you not, some people used to drink 20 instant coffees a day in there. They would be smoking cigarettes till the cows come home. Anything, going to the local kind of very, very overpriced corner shop, they would be buying those scratchies, anything, all of that will give you a dopamine spike. And so it is also worth sort of preparing clients for, it is normal you're going to feel this pull, and we need to sort of have a think about what's going to pull you, what would be your thing.
You have just witnessed a modern miracle of taste. It's awesome. Well done.
Okay, there we go.
One of my clients who went to rehab, she said that in rehab she used to get the Sara Lee chocolate cake, the whole slab, and she'd sit in rehab. She'd go and steal it from the freezers in the kitchen, and she'd sit in rehab and she'd eat the whole slab.
Every rehab has Sara Lee cake, by the way.
And she did say that she left rehab 20 kilos. So yes, it is. It is one of those things. It's a great analogy. One of the things so dopamine is such an interesting drug. So every time our brains get a little bit of reward of dopamine, when you scroll Instagram or when you scroll Facebook or LinkedIn, or when you have something new, when your eyes land on something new that you haven't seen before, dopamine gets released and encourages you to go after that thing and to explore that thing, as long as it's not too dangerous. So as long as you perceive it as interesting, novel and new, as opposed to not dangerous. And so part of the way dopamine functions in addiction, because, you know, if you go through the DSM criteria of addiction, one of the really important criteria is considerable time spent sourcing, attaining or searching for the drug. And that's where the dopamine gets released, that it isn't related to the actual taking of the chemicals as well. Completely separate thing, but dopamine is what we use if we're getting really tired and bored and we stand up and we shift our bodies, we get a little surge of dopamine with that. And if any of you have teenage boys in your life, I have one. Maggie Dent's got a really good podcast, where she just released a book, Raising Boys, and she talks about, it's again in the Conversations podcast, she talks about how kids and teenagers stop producing as much dopamine. They actually become, through the teenage years, they become a bit susceptible to any dopamine releasing kind of activity, which is why they do risk taking at that age more than you do when you get older, because you've got enough dopamine on board later. And she was saying that in her classrooms that boys would get up, and they would get up because they'd actually run out of dopamine and run out of the ability to pay attention and do the task. And so they'd get up and move around on their, you know, to release some dopamine. So part of what, and you should talk about the Gabor Mate's addiction to CDs. Part of what's really important in the drug is sort of in any addiction is that seeking kind of behaviour. So I work with a lot of people with eating disorders, which many of you know. You know, planning the meal for the day, counting calories, sorting all that out does release dopamine in the brain as well. But it just has a different kind of impact from actually taking drugs that release dopamine.
Okay.
So one of the difficulties also in terms of kind of ACEs, the impact of ACEs on early, on brain kind of structure, early ACEs on brain structure, is this issue around being able to manage impulse control. And we know that impulses kind of come up from the lower areas of the brain. The lower we mean kind of evolutionarily older or the limbic kind of areas. But impulse regulation comes from the prefrontal cortex. And so remember with the pain, physical and social pain, you got the sort of the behaviours happening in the limbic system, but the management of the behaviour is happening in the prefrontal cortex. But you only grow a prefrontal cortex, it's finished growing around the age of 25. It's being myelinated throughout throughout childhood, but also that there's even some belief that it actually takes longer for men or boys to finish growing their prefrontal cortex than girls. And what they've found in brain scans of addicts is kind of that there really isn't as much activity, and the area of the prefrontal cortex isn't quite as sort of myelinated and fatty and healthy as people who are not addicts as well. Now, one of the things around impulse control is that if any of you who've had babies or your aunts and uncles or spent time around babies, we're not born with impulse control. Impulse control, and if you have adolescents in your life, you know they don't have any impulse control. But we're not born with impulse control. Impulse control is something that arises from good enough parenting, from being in a safe rat park of an environment that teaches you impulse control with a safety net at the bottom, which doesn't let you destroy yourself if you try your own version of impulse control and it doesn't work. And I think this is one of the things around the ACEs is that it's not that the brain was predetermined to not have good impulse control. It was that the nature of the environment of that child or of that adolescent's environment didn't actually lead to good impulse control learning for that person. And, you often think about this, for me, is where the genetics of addiction comes in. Like if your parents are addicted, then they don't have great impulse control. If you're growing up in domestic violence and everyone's afraid, there's not great impulse control in those sort of situations either. So if you're raised by people who don't have good impulse control, what chance do you have at developing impulse control yourself? Because it is a learned or an acquired skill throughout childhood. And punishing people for lack of impulse control certainly doesn't suddenly make them have impulse control. I sort of talked about this in terms of the HPA axis, that the internal stress management system within people who are addicted to drugs is actually highly reactive. So the HPA axis leads people to really respond quickly with a big dousing of cortisol throughout the system. And so if you have that adverse experience of you're highly reactive, you have poor impulse control, then the value of a substance to you will be of much greater, so this is the rat in the Skinner box, it'll be of much greater value to somebody who actually who has a healthy enough HPA axis and does have decent impulse control. The impact of that drug to give you a high but also take away the stress that you experience will actually be really much more powerful than the person who actually has that dysregulation.
It's the same as the Bruce Perry quote, really.
Yeah. So it's kind of an explanation around why a drug can be so much more addictive for another person than for us.
Okay, so this is just to kind of bring it back in a circle as we now move sort of along into looking at really sort of attachment and kind of coming back to that idea that we've sort of woven our way now through the neurobiology and sort of how that is impacted both in the rat park or out of the rat park, and how that then sort of, relates to the neurobiology and addiction. Now we're going to start to move on to, okay, well, let's have a think about, because the third part, if we go down, if you have more ACEs, the third part is obviously the sort of social connections and social relationships and attachment relationships, and how that then has an impact as well on sort of attachments in particular to addiction. So attachment is, if we're thinking sort of in general, because it's probably worth just saying what we think of when we use the term attachment. The idea of attachment is sort of, it's an inborn system that motivates the infant to seek proximity at all points to the caregiver, in particular in any times of kind of stress or uncertainty. So if a child is not feeling as stressed, then they won't be sort of feeling, they'll be able to sort of spend a little bit of time away from their caregiver. But at the time when they get stressed or tired or hungry, first thing they will look for, and I see this, I have 2 babies that visit me at the moment in my room, which is lovely. Not randomly, because that would be a bit, they do
don't bring themselves.
They don't bring themselves. I've started very, very young therapy. But it's really interesting because they're very happy to sort of crawl around on the floor or be sort of held by me or play around with the toys or whatever until the minute they're hungry or tired. You can see exactly what happens. Or scared, but hopefully they don't get that scared.
They knock something over or something, there's a bang outside.
When they try and sit up and they hit their heads, they fall back down, that one. Then they will go straight back. Where do they go? They will automatically look to the caregiver. Now that's if in place you've got someone to look at. When you do, because when they have that, they get picked up and the sort of situation resolves and then they can go back around. Okay. So if we think about this in kind of more psychoanalytic, psychodynamic terms, because we want to sort of give you different flavors of how all of this looks sort of throughout, that in psychodynamic terms, we would think of kind of the idea of needing a safe container. That would be the kind of concept of attachment that would be used, and that if you have a safe container, you can bring and unload whatever it is that's happening, so the baby can sort of tap in and feel contained and held. That's where those kind of phrases come from, that sense of I feel contained. And the idea of therapy is that we form, in a way, a safe container for people who haven't ever had that experience of what it's like to actually have somewhere to take whatever is happening in my internal world. That I've got a whole bunch of stuff bubbling around here and I haven't, if I've never had anywhere to take it, all I can do is look for something or someone to be able to repress it and push it down. And you start to look for artificial means. So that's sort of going along, and that's the word container very much comes from the work of Bion. Now what we're going to move into is, okay, well, we talked about the RAP part, but if we're looking at attachment, what is the research that's done around sort of attachment and addiction, and how did the RAP part kind of go human style? So Renee Spitz was a, sorry, put something in my throat.
She's a bit emotional.
I think it's probably a little bit of Tim Tam. Renee Spitz is a psychoanalyst around the 1940s. He was kind of, if you think around that Bowlby sort of area, prior to him, there was sort of Freud and kind of that era, which was very much sort of, this is shifting now into looking at, okay, what is it? Let's sort of make some sense of what's actually happening around attachment. And in particular, because this was sort of post-war, there was a lot of children who during the war and after the war had been socially dislocated and away from sort of families. And so we kind of want to make a bit of sense of, do you know what I mean, what it's like. He realised that you can't obviously do a study like a RAP Park study with children because unethical, they sort of knew that. So instead he did the kind of research where you use direct observation of children who are already in set situations and sort of follow them through, so that none of this was constructed for the purpose of his research. And the research that he did was in South America. And he followed 2 different groups of children from the time they were born until they were several years old, to sort of watch and see and try and make sense of, in a sense, what is it that can shape these children, and where do they sort of end up going down the track with whatever their early life environment and attachment was. So the first group that he had was raised in an orphanage, and these babies were pretty much cut off, think Romanian orphanage type scenario. You can see a photo of it down there. They were cut off from any sort of form of human contact in their cribs. And there'd be one nurse who was caring for 7 babies. The second group were raised in a nursery in a prison. And so if you think about Rat Pack, they were caged. They were literally in the cell, but they were in the cell with their mothers who were incarcerated. And the mothers actually gave the babies affection every day. The babies could sort of see each other and the prison staff throughout the day, and were able to kind of interact with different scenarios. Now, That's the orphanage as they kind of had grown a bit older. By the way, there's a movie that is made that Renee Spitz made, which actually sort of shows this whole study as well. What he found was that at 4 months, being raised in the two different environments, their development was actually sort of pretty similar, but it was around 1 year where they started to have a real difference. That those raised in the orphanage, so these are the ones, remember, that are raised sort of 7 children, 1 person, and very much kind of isolated. They had started by this point in their motor skills and intellectual performance to lag behind. They were less curious, less playful, and they became a lot more prone to infections. By 2 to 3 years, so you think about, we're still only up to 3 years, the children who were raised in prisons were all walking and talking confidently, and they were still behind some of the children outside of prisons, but not significantly. Only 2 of the 26 children raised in the orphanage could walk, and they could still only manage a few words. That sort of research kind of came into, through this, by the way, if anyone's ever heard the term anaclitic depression, that came out of some of this research. And it's that depression that comes with sort of being deprived from an attachment figure. And if that depression isn't resolved, so if within about 4 to 5 months that's not resolved, he actually called it hospitalism, which is the whole idea of sort of the whole system starting to just shut down altogether. They actually came out, interestingly, of that research has sort of led to, that led to a lot of the Bowlby research and a lot of the others sort of saying, okay, this is telling us what we sort of knew in a hunch, which is that the most important thing is very much the attachment. It's not, we need to kind of get away from looking at other sort of settings and environments and actually go, the most important clearly is that the mother and child stay connected. In one of the ways, this has actually gone on to even shape policy, because in New York, just after the war, there was a big hospital there. And at that point, what used to happen is if your child needed to go to hospital, they would be dropped off at the hospital and the hospital would care for them. And then you'd come at the end of their hospital stay and pick them up. And initially what would happen is the children were on really big wards, and when they were on these really big wards, the infection rate understandably was really high. And so they got really worried the mortality rate was really high, and they attributed the mortality rate saying, okay, I think that this is because of the infections. So we'll put them instead in cubicles where they couldn't see any other child or person, and that this will protect them. And we'll not only that, think COVID, we'll come up in masks as well when we come up to them. The mortality rate went up, not down, when they did that. But interestingly, when they got back home, for the ones that kind of made it through that, what they found was the minute they were reunited, their weight went back up and they stabilised in a lot of other ways. And because of that, they actually changed policy where the nurses and that were actually allowed to mother. They still didn't get to the policy yet where the mother could stay, but they allowed then nurses to kind of pick them up and hug them and hold them.
One of the interesting things, I was just listening to I sound like I only listen to podcasts when I know, but there was listening to some research today about how critical oxytocin is to the immune system. So oxytocin is one of the oldest neuropeptides of the brain in terms of evolution. And it makes a lot of sense that if kids are deprived of oxytocin, their immune system's going to stop functioning as well.
Okay, so this is, by the way, a very good book if you're interested in addiction and looking at addiction and attachment. And Flores kind of then talks about, so if we take, okay, what happens for our clients that maybe grew up, maybe not in an orphanage, but at the same point, you can have, as I'm sure you'd know from people you see, some of those kind of correlates of not having that safe sort of maternal, paternal attachment sort of needs fulfilled at birth. And what happens is, as Flores says, that develops on into, well, I need to find myself some chemical connections, because if I'm not going to get these needs met for humans, then there are other things that I can sort of start to do. Hence, you go to that research on ACEs and early kind of, why is it that people are early likely to pick up illicit drugs? Well, clearly this would be a part of it. And the idea that, you know, in addiction, the sort of idea of attachment to the substance, that we can't break this, as Flora says, unless we start to develop other attachments, which is also where therapy comes into play. Okay, so there's an inverse relationship. This is another very good book, and the foreword's by Lou Cozolino, who is also fantastic. There's an inverse relationship between addiction and healthy interpersonal attachment. In other words, if you have a secure attachment, if you're lucky enough, as you know, John Breer says, to be one of the few who grew up,
one of the 3 people who got secure attachment growing up,
then you are much less likely. This relates, it's another way of saying if you've got less ACEs, really. Because the importance being, because we cannot biologically regulate our own affect ourselves for a long period of time, then we need to have sort of other attachments to be able to do that. And if we can't find that in humans, then we're going to, if we can't co-regulate with a human, we're going to need to co-regulate basically with the substance. You got anything you want to say about that?
No. Don't worry, I'm going to chime in at some point. Jace was like, when can I hand over to Sophie? So in terms of, let me just put a caveat here around attachment. If you, there's lots of stuff around attachment and dating and connection. Pia Melody has written Love Addiction. She has some awesome stuff. She comes from a 12-step model. But what's really great is that even if you didn't get a secure attachment in childhood, you can have earned secure in adulthood, which is really the outcome of enough therapy. For some of us, that's a lot of therapy. But it's the outcome of a lot of good therapy, is that you learn to have a healthy attachment with your therapist and a healthy attachment between your adult self and your child self. And it's really lovely. I'm just doing this work with somebody, and we're about 4 years into therapy, and she's really going, oh my God, I'm less reactive. I've got better impulse control. I'm not eating the whole Sara Lee cake tray. I'm not screaming at my partner. And she's going, I think I'm getting the earth secure. It's really great that she could actually have a qualitative experience around that. So all is not lost in terms of any of this. Okay, one of the things, so there's Peter Fonagy on the bottom right-hand side there. One of the things that Peter Fonagy really sort of talks about is that we walk around the world gathering knowledge and gathering experiences from the world and from other people. And he has this concept called epistemic trust. And epistemic trust is this concept where you trust the authenticity of and personal relevance of an interpersonally transmitted piece of information. Really unhelpful definition. Essentially, kids need epistemic trust to be able to learn at school. They need to trust that the teacher wants to teach them something of worth, isn't bullshitting them, or isn't playing favourites, and is somebody who actually is a person of knowledge to impart information and useful knowledge. So it definitely has a role at school, but it has a role across the board in terms of how you relate to lots of people, how you learn from the environment, whether you experience people as trustworthy and relevant to you. And what he showed was that, you know, that was related to ACEs as well. So people who had higher rates of ACEs actually had lower rates of epistemic trust in terms of believing that other people could be trustworthy. One of the key points that we see with people who have high rates of ACEs is they have huge problems trusting anybody in authority, anybody who actually might know something about medicine, might know something about law, might know something about, you know, anybody in a policing situation, because their experience is that people are inherently untrustworthy. But life is so different. And one of the difficulties that you sort of hear in these stories is they start behaving in ways that then bring attention to them, that then the police get, you know, the police kind of attract the attention of police, and then they get picked up, and it all confirms their lack of epistemic trust. And so really breakdown in social connections leads to the opposite of epistemic trust, which is epistemic vigilance, or any kind of defensive state, so nervous system kind of defensive state. And leads to kind of needing to have something that will soothe them out of that defensive state, something that's soothing, reliable, quantifiable, and this is where, you know, drugs of addiction start to come into this space as well, and that addictive behaviours kind of provide the only relief from constantly living in a sympathetic nervous system vigilant kind of state or defensive state. This is back to you, my friend.
Okay, so that's one of Gabor Mate's books in the realm of Hungry Ghosts. And he sort of talks, when he's talking about attachment, you know, he goes through the idea that you can have these sort of happy, you know, attuned kind of interactions between a mother and child, and there's this lovely release of natural sort of opioids in the infant's brain, and that this promotes kind of the attachment, because if I feel good, if what's coming into my brain makes me feel good, I'm going to want to do more of it, and that sort of then feeds. Whereas if you think about it, if the parent is somehow scary or unpredictable, unreliable, and I'm getting cortisol surges, that's not going to let me make me want to lead towards further kind of interactions with that scary, unpredictable person. So if we think about, I mean, that sort of, as he says, stress reduces the number of opioid and dopamine receptors, where, like, if you thought about that graph that sort of we drew, which is sort of related much more to drugs, but also kind of would be in a lesser way with stress. And the attachment promotes that. So basically, as he said, dopamine levels will fluctuate depending on the presence or absence of a parent. Now, that gets back to exactly what René Spitz found way back in the 1940s, you know, that was there. His view is, and again, this I want to put out that a lot of these views are contentious, and so everybody, you know, you can kind of, we're not sort of coming down saying yes or no to any of these in particular, but he would say that drugs themselves don't make anyone into an addict, any more than food actually makes someone a compulsive eater, that there has to be the pre-existing vulnerability that's there, and there has to be significant stress. That stressors alone or kind of pre-exist, you know, drugs alone themselves are not going to sort of create addiction. And he talks about addiction being any single repeated behaviour that you feel compelled to persist regardless of its negative impacts. You're not thinking consequential thinking here. You're just going, this helps me in the moment and I'm going to do it. So it involves a compulsive engagement with the behaviour. You're preoccupied with it. You think about it when you're not doing it. You've got impaired control. Think about the impulse regulation. You can't sort of control it, even though you go in sometimes thinking, I want to be able to. And there's a persistence of kind of, or a relapse despite sort of evidence of harm. So I can think, like, if we think sort of both through drug court or children being removed, that was not always enough, despite that evidence, to actually stop someone using an addiction. And there's a kind of irritability and craving if the object is not instantly available. So if I can't get it, then I will be kind of just more and more and more irritable that I can't get hold of it at that time.
We just have a helicopter going overhead to land at RPA. So if you can hear that noise, you might not be able to.
So when he comes down and says, and this is often the case that often people who come and see go, well, how do I know it's an addiction or it's just kind of, you know, I'm just using it? And, you know, he would really say it depends on if you're in the driver's seat and if you have control. So, and you can do little experiments with people. But his whole point is that when it shifts into addiction, is that it's really about, I do this to make life more livable. So it's not just to make it fun or pleasant, it's really to make it, the key word is livable.
Yeah.
And that most people with addictions are actually more afraid of living than they are of dying. I mean, they do high-risk activities, especially in illicit drugs, very high-risk activities for dying. Addictions kind of always originate in pain, and that they function very much as kind of, you know, emotional anesthetics. That won't surprise anyone.
And we've sort of talked about this before, that the pain pathways in humans are are the same as the social isolation pathways, and that you know, the feel of physical pain is very much attached to the feel of social isolation, exclusion, loss of dopamine, loss of oxytocin. And, you know, I was just reflecting on, I think that's the same with I have clients with severe and enduring anorexia. They're terrified of living because eating enough food to feel your emotions, because really the aim in severe and enduring anorexia is the avoidance of all emotions. And so if you avoid emotions, you lose the good and the bad. You don't just lose the bad. And it's very much about a fear of living on life's terms and experiencing the pain. And one of the difficulties is we get people well enough physically, and then the second half of treatment, and the other 50% of treatment, is helping them find a way to make life livable.
So one of the things around addiction that are things to sort of think about, and take, to, I don't know, you can be in peer supervisions or therapies or in your own journal or whatever it may be. But I do think that these are absolutely things that we have to consider if we're going to work in this sort of area. Is, first of all, what challenges have you actually faced in your own life related to addiction? Have you ever found yourself ever in life doing a behaviour that you know is actually harmful and yet you keep doing it? Kind of whether it's harmful to yourself or others, that there's some aspect of it that you keep going, I won't do it again, or no, I'll be much better on Monday, or any of that gives you a little flavour of it. We know that part of the reason we need to go down these pathways and think is that the attitude towards someone who's addicted is one of the most influential factors as to whether or not treatment will actually succeed. And it's that whole sense of, can you actually see in front of you, if you think about Janina Fisher's model, can you see that younger, really hurt child, think Renee Spitz and going back into kind of early in their life when their needs weren't met? Can you get there from sometimes the raging kind of angry presentation? I mean, we used to get, holes punched in walls or whatever. Can you get past that? Because we need to be able to do that. Another question I think we all have to consider is, what do you actually believe is possible about recovery? Do you believe in recovery? Because I think it's very hard to do this work if you don't believe. And what does recovery mean? Does recovery for them, is your version of recovery, they will be off every single drug? Is that, because I think we have to define, otherwise, if we don't have a shared language with the client about what recovery means, then automatically we're misattuning because we're on different pages, we're going down different pathways. And in taking that, when we talk about how you feel, how do you feel about clients who come in and gamble excessively, and they might, maybe if they've got rid of a lot of the money that, their family needs, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about someone who's shooting up using illicit drugs? How do you feel about, drugs and pregnancy? How do you feel about someone who's drinking excessively or who comes in saying, I'm spending hours and hours kind of daily just gaming online?
And I think an important add in there is also somebody who's porn addicted or sex addicted as well, because that starts to break some of the, monogamy kind of, rules that our society likes to live by.
So basically, the question from all of that, as we said, if you go back to sort of the Gabor-Mate, is that who's in charge is whether or not a passion actually becomes an addiction. Is it the individual or is it their behaviour? Addiction is when they completely go back, as we've said, to a behaviour, even though it could be harming yourself and others. And a question to sort of pose to people is, given the harm you're doing to yourself and others, are you willing to stop? That's now, I don't know, you'll always get an answer, because you'll also often get people saying, yes, 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 but I can't. But that also, whether or not it's implicitly or explicitly applied, you'll get an answer from that sort of question. The hungry ghost realm is kind of like, the reason we put this in is because people probably wonder, why is Gabor-Mate's book about, in the realm of the hungry ghost? The idea in Buddhist cosmology is that humans cycle through to get to sort of, their pathway through the world, 6 different realms of existence. And the hungry ghost realm is one of those kind of base sort of realms that they work their way through. It's down nearer the bottom, if that makes sense. If you think about kind of a hierarchy, it's down the bottom here. And people, this is a picture here of a hungry ghost. It's that idea of, they're pictured as kind of their tiny mouths. It's talked about, they often say it's the kind of the size of a pin. That you can't actually fit enough food in, and huge kind of great big empty stomachs, that there's a constant need and desire that is there. Their arms and legs are like threads, so they can't actually get to where the food is, and their long thin neck means that it's a long way, even if they get a little bit in, before it actually gets in and sort of satiates. So people who are stuck in the hungry ghost realm in Buddhist cosmology, it's the idea of they're stuck in a constant extreme. This would be someone that we've talked about with extremely high ACEs and this constant need and hunger. And no matter what I put in it, I can never kind of, do you know what I mean, fill it.
And I like it that they have flames coming out of their mouth, so they actually destroy the thing that they're after as well. So that's kind of that analogy of destroying relationships and addiction.
Now, Vincent Folletti is the author of the ACE study. As he said, if you relate it to the hungry ghost, it's hard to get enough of something that almost works. I love that quote.
That's an amazing quote. I've used that with a client who had a lot of addiction in terms of sex and relationship addiction.
Okay. So this is just the final.
I mean, essentially, this is really just sort of talking about how having a hypervigilant, high stress responsive brain means that your life starts to get smaller. Because, you know, if I think about my client who I'm trying to get her back to groups, everything irritates her. Everybody is out to get her. She wants to kind of smash her way through, you know, everything. Everything is really, really stressful. And then she kind of destroys relationships with people. And so, you know, across the sort of 16 years since she left rehab, and she's still cleaning out, her life has just sort of gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. We've only just started working together kind of consistently and regularly and long-term kind of work. And that's one of the difficulties, is that this irritable kind of, you know, sympathetic nervous system that is really hypervigilant for stress starts to reduce down their kind of exposure to being able to get the things that would make, you know, that would make life worth living.
And another way of saying that, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy, is say you get someone who's been lucky enough pre-addiction to get moments of self-actualization, that as addiction progresses and someone gets more engaged in addiction, that gradually what happens is obviously you stop getting those moments, your self-esteem, your feeling about yourself starts to, respect of others goes, then it starts to affect your relationships and people don't trust you anymore. And so your sort of family, sexual intimacy goes because you're using substances. Then the safety and security, both physically, because you often obviously fall asleep, leaving the gas on and the door open and that practical stuff, but your employment starts to be shaken. You know, your health starts to be shaken, your property because you haven't got enough money, all of those things, your morals, which is part of that level as well. Like maybe you do things you wouldn't normally do and that you're ashamed of. Until finally, if you go, you know, deep into addiction, you end up without you're not feeding yourself properly, drinking enough water, your sleep goes, and you don't have enough shelter. So just as the process of recovery, you need to begin with where the person has got to in their addiction and hit that level of Maslow and work back up. At the same point, it kind of tells you a little bit about the journey down. I'll often use that again also, by the way, with clients. So just kind of the idea of just one more takes us sort of quickly into the 12th step, which we are just coming up to now. The idea of Primo Levi, which we just put in here, by the way, it's kind of when we think about addiction, just before we go into the 12th step, he says that, you know, the more distant, this is why we got you to think a little bit about how you feel about certain things, is that if we can connect into the child, as he said, we can be moved and connect. But it takes a greater emotional kind of imagination to empathise with something that's a lot more distant to our own lives. And so if we don't see the child in the adult, then what happens is there will be a distance kind of created by the nature of the fact that maybe we haven't sort of lived on the streets in addiction or before. Okay, so we've talked about the 12 steps. The one thing we want to put in just around 12 steps in trauma, because obviously we've already said about 12 steps being, you know, the benefits of 12 steps. But just using the trauma lens, what is important is, if you've ever been to a 12-step meeting, you will know that there are slogans. Every 12-step meeting worldwide has slogans, kind of the same posters all around the walls and up. And these are pretty much the type of things that you will see on them. Just for today is a big one. But some of these slogans, it's important remembering that if you come from a background of trauma, they can be quite challenging. And it's worth, if someone that you see goes to 12-step, to sort of just say it's okay that some of these might be hard. So living in today is going to be really difficult for someone with unresolved trauma, even though just for today is probably the main of the kind of mantra as such that goes with AA. Think the drink through is one that's there. But if you're constantly in sympathetic nervous system and your frontal lobe's offline, you ain't going to be thinking any drink through at that point. Stinking thinking is the idea of stinking thinking leads to addiction. Now, the difficulty with that is some of the thinking that might have led to addiction was actually what was geared around their survival and was actually really sort of beneficial to the, you know, to someone to get through the kind of trauma that they've gone through. Another one you hear quite a lot is we're only as sick as our secrets, which is why the whole will come up at the front and say, hi, I'm Bob, I'm sort of 20 years sober, and they talk about what's happened, with the idea being to reduce shame, which makes sense. But the difficulty is keeping secrets often in a family where you've grown up with trauma can be really essential to survival. Another one is that whole idea of take the cotton out of your ears and put it in your mouth, which I always thought was a very weird saying anyway. But it's that whole, it can be interpreted as, you know, don't talk, don't trust, and causes them to shut down. And it's not actually that at all, but it is, again, sort of quite important, do you know what I mean, around... so it's just, I guess we just put that there to sort of think about.
We got there. We thank you so much,